The small island nation of Cyprus is no stranger to conflict. Strategically located less than 100 kilometers off the coasts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon, Cyprus has often been used as a military base by larger powers vying for control of the eastern Mediterranean and the Suez Canal. The advent of the 20th century proved no exception to this rule, as Cyprus was a crown colony of the British Empire and acted as a strategic supply center for Entente forces fighting the Ottomans. Fortunately for the Cypriots, the Great War passed by without any direct fighting taking place on their homeland. However, the tremendous advances in military aviation technology during the interwar years all but guaranteed that Cyprus would play a much greater role in the next global conflict. Indeed, right from the very start of World War II, Cyprus would serve as a vital naval and air base for the British Empire. This put it directly in the crosshairs of both the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Regia Aeronautica, who conducted extensive bombing raids on the island during the early years of the war. With Axis forces on the advance across most theaters of war and control of the Mediterranean still contested by the powerful Italian Navy, British High Command feared the bombing of Cyprus was a potential precursor to full-scale invasion. With their military resources already stretched to breaking point fighting a war on multiple fronts, the British quickly determined that Cyprus was both too important a strategic asset to lose, yet far too remote to easily reinforce with the manpower needed to repel a determined enemy assault by land and sea. The situation worsened considerably in the spring of 1941, when the Luftwaffe launched a shockingly successful invasion of the island of Crete using nothing but airborne assets, a feat then unequaled in military history. Though the heavy casualties suffered by the paratrooper divisions would convince the Germans not to repeat such an operation in the future, in the short term, it left the British planners scrambling for any solution to a seemingly imminent new threat. But the British were masters of improvisation, a trend that would evidently inspire the Cypriots themselves when it came to utilizing the leftovers of their war effort over a decade later. Shortly after the fall of Crete, they launched Operation Cascade, a grand deception intended to fool the Axis powers into thinking they faced a fantasy force many divisions stronger than actually existed on the ground. As part of Operation Cascade, the cavalry regiment of the 7th Australian Division made landfall on Cyprus with a limited number of tanks, trucks, and machine gun carriers. Even when combined with the 500 or so local Cypriot conscripts, this was little more than a token force. But rather than stand as a bulwark against German aggression, the Australians were instead there to deceive them into inaction. Under constant threat of bombing and strafing attacks, the brave Australians spread out their forces across the island and conducted extensive military patrols, creating as much dust and smoke as possible. All across the Mediterranean theater, similar displays took place, reinforced by sustained radio chatter and even false reports deliberately leaked to Axis intelligence units operating out of Egypt. Audacious though it was, Operation Cascade was a major success, causing Germans and Italian strategic planners to overestimate the size of the British forces in the theater by upwards of 45%. As the war progressed and the tides turned against Germany and its Italian allies in the Mediterranean theater, the military importance of Cyprus slowly decreased. By the end of 1941, the threat of invasion had receded to the point the 7th Australian Cavalry Regiment was redeployed elsewhere, taking the majority of their equipment with them. However, there was at least one notable exception to this rule: a single Valentine Mk II tank that remained behind on the island and would play an important role in events well outside the scope of World War II. The origins of this lonely Valentine are unclear, but photographs exist of one being used in a training role on Cyprus alongside several cruiser Mk II tanks. Since both of these designs were obsolete by the mid-war period, it is reasonable to assume they were used by the local Cyprus regiment for low-priority guard duties until decommissioned entirely. given the significant weight of the Valentine chassis. Shipping it all the way back across the Mediterranean for disassembly would have been highly inefficient, and so the turret and machine gun were simply removed in order to demilitarize it. This left the Crown Colony with the question of what exactly they were going to do with a roughly 15-ton armored tractor. Fortunately, an answer was close to hand. Since ancient times, Cyprus had hosted a highly lucrative copper mining industry, and the profits for this enterprise were about to skyrocket as the European economy sought raw materials to rebuild from the devastation inflicted by World War II. The vast open-pit mines that dotted Cyprus were hazardous places at the best of times, but the lumbering, rugged chassis of the Valentine Mk II could have been tailor-made for such conditions. Thus, the lone vehicle began a new career as a mining tractor, using its powerful engine and high traction to haul large quantities of ore to wherever they were needed. Exactly how long the Valentine Mk II remained in this civilian role is unclear, but it was evidently decommissioned sometime during the 1950s after the copper boom was over. The 50s and early 60s were a period in Europe dominated by decolonization initiatives as the old empires gradually relinquished their control over holdings in foreign lands. Cyprus was no exception, gaining its independence in 1960. But like many British colonies, Cyprus had been subject to deep ethnic divisions that promised to cause friction as soon as the colonial yoke was lifted. The native populace consisted of roughly 77% Greeks and 18% Turks, and a new Cypriot constitution soon proved totally inadequate at addressing the many legal disputes and religious frictions between the two groups. By 1963, civil war was looming on the horizon, prompting President and Archbishop Makarios III to seek constitutional reform with the help of his vice president, Fazil Kuchu, and hurriedly drafted his proposal to the governments of Greece, Great Britain, and Turkey. But the efforts of Makarios were rendered futile by the continued belligerency of the Turkish population, which remained convinced that these suggestions would not result in a desirable outcome. The messy situation was cluttered further by the fact that militants, on all sides, were busily arming themselves in preparation for an outbreak of hostilities, often independently of their political representatives. In late December, Greek police officers received a tip-off that Turkish militants were planning to smuggle and distribute a large cache of automatic weapons to the areas around Nicosia. This prompted a wave of heavy-handed car searches in the area, which the Turkish locals perceived as racially motivated acts of oppression. Local radicals incited the population, and an armed resistance soon began shadowing the movements of the police forces. On the 23rd of December at 2:30 a.m., a Turkish couple were pulled over by the Greek officers who attempted to forcibly search their vehicle. Local resistance members responded by attacking the officers, and in the ensuing battle, both the car occupants were killed. The death of civilians all but guaranteed the failure of the peace movement, and despite the president's objections, he was soon forced by the British Commissioner's Office to deploy government troops to combat the militants. Given the ethnic nature of the conflict, the government strategy involved maintaining what was described as the Green Line, which was effectively just an armed barricade separating the Greek and Turkish enclaves in major population centers in order to keep them from shooting at each other. This naturally meant that government peacekeepers came under fire from perturbed militants on both sides. While Makarios struggled to bring the Turks back to the negotiating table, the severely undergunned Cypriot military was left desperately scrambling for something, anything, that could keep them safe from angry partisans and bolster failing morale in the hot zones. It was here that, presumably, some Cypriot soldier with past experience in the mining industry remembered seeing what looked awfully like an old British tank hauling rocks across the quarry. The timeline of events leading up to the vehicle's reactivation is obscure, but one can well imagine a group of soldiers scouring the local scrapyards until one of their number stumbled across the turretless vehicle. The improvised vehicle was then given the designation Ethveka Enea. This comes from the Greek Ethniki Chrura Enea, which translates to National Guard 19. The number 19 is the vehicle number, marking the Valentine hull out as one of many such improvised IFVs deployed during the Civil War. Reborn once again as a military vehicle, the improvised Valentine Mk II retained the same armor layout as the original, with an upper glacis and sides sporting 60mm thick plates, a 17mm thick rear plate, and a 7mm armored floor. The engine used for this specific model was the AAC A190 diesel, with a maximum output of 131 horsepower at 18,000 RPM. The power-to-weight ratio on the original tank would have been 8.1 horsepower per ton, but the lack of a heavy turret likely improved this slightly. The problem was that the Valentine's turret contained all of its firepower, and without it, the vehicle was little more than a glorified armored tractor. To solve this issue, Cypriot engineers welded a large rectangular armored superstructure with an angled roof over the turret ring, creating an improvised fighting compartment. This, ironically, gave the Valentine a more than passing resemblance to the British Whippet tanks used during the Great War. Just like the Whippet, the armament of the new vehicle was restricted to light machine guns aimed and fired through small portholes cut into the superstructure. The new fighting compartment measured roughly 1.5 meters tall and 2 meters wide, resulting in a vehicle that was 5.41 meters long, 2.63 meters wide, and about 2.5 meters tall, with the added superstructure, which was composed of 8mm thick steel plates. To get in and out of the new fighting compartment, the engineers installed a pair of trapdoors, one at the front and one at the back. Conditions inside were cramped, limiting the weapons that could be used to small arms like Bren guns or submachine guns. Apart from this major modification, the vehicle remained mostly normal, except for the missing side skirts, which had likely been removed during its mining career to save weight. The driver's vision port had also been removed at some point, forcing the engineers to weld a thick piece of metal over it to keep the crewmen safe from enemy fire. Other missing pieces of equipment included the driver's periscopes, water deflectors, and headlights. In its new state, the improvised Valentine Mk II was, frankly, a pale shadow of the original tank, lacking any features that made it viable for modern combat operations. But it was not being asked to go into combat against a modern army. Instead, it was being deployed against poorly armed rebels whose only combat experience was taking potshots at police blockades or brawling with rival factions. Against such a force, this improvised vehicle was a veritable behemoth, completely invulnerable to anything they can throw at it. After its completion, the new tank was placed under the command of the 7th Regular Group of Volunteers of the National Guard, who deployed it in February of 1964 at the city of Limassol. Fighting in Limassol was particularly violent, with the Greek-Cypriots using explosives to level large sections of the Turkish quarter of the city in order to deny their use to the rebels. With their homes and property being rapidly demolished, the entire Turkish population of the city retreated to the community school, where government forces placed them under siege. This did not stop rebels from turning the surrounding region into a battleground, however, and attempts at a ceasefire proved inadequate due to a lack of clear boundaries between the warring sides. Surprisingly enough, the improvised Valentine excelled in this kind of chaos. Able to project firepower in all directions from the superstructure and immune to most forms of attack, the vehicle could easily lock down a section of the city and provide beleaguered government forces with a mobile fortress to rally around. The National Guard understood the tank's strengths and weaknesses and did not allow themselves to fall into the trap of treating it like a superweapon. Rather than being sent out alone, the Valentine was closely supported by infantry from the 7th Volunteers, whose presence made up for its shortcomings in mobility and situational awareness. Thanks primarily to the presence of the Valentine and other improvised IFVs, the Greek forces were able to steadily grind down the Turkish resistance in Limassol and push them out of their strongholds. While this left large swaths of the city in ruins, it remained one of the very few settlements in all of Cyprus where the government was able to win a decisive victory and put a stop to the factional infighting. Shortly after managing to lock down Limassol, British troops intervened in the conflict and a ceasefire was arranged between the various warring factions, with the Turkish Cypriots finally agreeing to surrender their arms. On April 1st, the Valentine Mk II Improvised took part in a victory parade at Limassol, which showcased the accomplishments of the 7th Volunteers and bolstered both local morale and Cypriot confidence in the government forces. With no more wars to fight, the aging vehicle was formally decommissioned. But unlike the first time it had been demobilized, the Valentine would not simply be discarded and left to languish in obscurity. Instead, it was placed into storage at the local police station, where it remained for an indeterminate period of time. More recently, it was spotted on display at a National Guard War Museum, alongside other improvised tanks and armored fighting vehicles used during the Civil War. With a long and storied service record in both military and civilian hands, the Valentine Mk II Improvised demonstrates how a vehicle's on-paper specifications are a poor way to judge how useful it could be in the right hands. From helping dissuade an Axis invasion to defeating a local insurgency, the tank proved itself useful in every role it was deployed, while its rugged design allowed it to remain operational even after years of use as a quarry tractor. When handled carefully and deployed in situations where its limitations were not a hindrance, the Valentine remained a force multiplier decades after the design had been officially retired. This concludes our look at the Valentine Mk II Improvised, a sterling example of the military adage that a bad tank is better than no tank at all. What did you think of the modifications the vehicle received? Did you think this was the best improvised vehicle of the Cypriot Civil War? What other improvised vehicles would you like us to cover? Please let us know in the comments below. We'd like to give a special thanks to our medium and heavy tank tier Patreon supporters: Dave Shuford, Sopwith21, Dan Fitzpatrick, Owen M, and R. Rob. Your generous contributions help fund our research, illustrations, and video production. Until next time, keep us in your sights.